Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a question that, let's be honest, if you've ever had a pet, you've probably wondered about.
Oh, definitely.
What is actually going on inside their heads?
Mm.
Do they think like us? Do they reason?
And what about consciousness? Is that something animals experience?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to help us unpack all this, we've been looking into a whole range of philosophical arguments and theories, trying to understand the nature and maybe the limits of animal minds.
Yeah, our mission today is basically to sort through these complex ideas. We want to understand what we think we know, what's still really up for debate.
And what it all means for how we see the animal kingdom.
Exactly. And we'll be drawing on philosophical work, looking at both historical views and, more contemporary perspectives.
Okay.
We're mainly focusing on two big sets of problems discussed in the sources. First, the challenges around animal thought and reason.
Right.
And second, the even trickier questions surrounding animal consciousness. Perfect. So, for everyone listening, have you ever found yourself just staring at your dog or cat, trying to guess what they're plotting?
Or wondering if that clever look is just instinct or, something more.
Well, today we're diving deep into those exact questions. Let's try and shed some light on this whole thing.
All right.
So let's start with that first set. The problems of animal thought and reason. Where do we begin?
Well, I think a good starting point is look back at some historical views that really kicked off this debate. And a key figure here is David Hume back in the 18th century.
Hume, okay. What was his take?
He was actually pretty confident. He basically argued that animals clearly possess thought and reason, much like humans do.
Really? That strong a view back then. What was his reasoning?
Hume was big on analogy, on comparing behavior. He defined belief, quite simply, as a vivid idea, like a strong mental image linked to a past sensation.
Okay.
And reason for him was almost an instinct for associating these ideas based on past experience.
So because animals act in ways similar to us?
Exactly. And since we know we operate by associating ideas, Hume saw similar behaviors in animals and concluded they must have similar underlying mental processes. For him, the evidence from behavior was almost irrefutable.
That comparison feels intuitive, doesn't it? But I imagine that view wasn't without its critics, even later on.
Oh, definitely not. A major critique is that Hume's definition of belief seems, well, a bit thin.
Thin how?
When we usually talk about believing something, say the sky is blue, that belief has content, it makes a claim about the world. A simple, vivid idea doesn't necessarily do that.
Right, you can picture red without believing anything about red.
Precisely. He even uses that example. And beliefs are typically thought to aim at truth, whereas an idea doesn't have to. If the definition of belief is shaky, then his definition of reason as just associating ideas also gets wobbly, since reason seems to involve connections between beliefs.
Got it. So just because the behavior looks the same on the outside doesn't mean the internal process is identical, like a robot vacuum cleaner navigating a room.
That's a perfect analogy. It might look intelligent, but we don't assume it's thinking about where to go. That's a core problem for Hume's view. Similar behaviors can arise from very different underlying mechanisms. A wind-up toy dog wagging its tail isn't thinking.
Okay, so moving to another major historical figure, Descartes. He had a completely opposite view, right? Much more skeptical about animal minds.
Totally opposite. Yeah, Descartes was very wary of elevating animal souls, as he might put it, to the level of human ones. He famously proposed two main arguments against animal thought and reason: the language test and the action test.
Okay, let's start with the language test. What was the idea there?
Descartes saw language, specifically what he called declarative speech-making statements, asserting things as the only reliable external sign of thought.
The only one, wow.
Yeah. He observed that speech and thought share key features. They have specific content, they aren't just automatic responses to immediate stimuli, and they aren't necessarily tied to any immediate action. We can think about or talk about almost anything, anytime.
So, for Descartes, the fact that animals don't produce this kind of speech was proof they don't think.
That was his conclusion, and he tried to head off other explanations. He argued it wasn't just because they lacked the right vocal organs.
Right, because parrots can mimic sounds but don't convert.
Exactly. And even humans who were deaf and mute develop sign languages. He also said it wasn't about general intelligence levels, because even humans considered less intelligent can speak. And unlike human infants who don't speak yet but we assume will think, Descartes argued animals never reach a developmental stage where clear signs of thought emerge. So for him, the simplest explanation was the absence of the thing language expresses, thought itself. Language was the window to the thinking soul. and animals didn't open that window.
That's a pretty stark view. What were the main counter-arguments raised against this language test?
Quite a few. One point raised by philosophers like Malcolm is about what's called dispositional thought, having beliefs even when you're not actively thinking about them.
Like my dog believing the mail carrier comes at a certain time, even if he's asleep.
Precisely. The dog acts as if it has that belief, even without language. Another line of argument, from linguists like Chomsky, suggests the key difference might not be thought itself, but a specific linguistic ability called recursion embedding phrases within phrases infinitely.
Ah, the thing that lets us build complex sentences.
Right. Maybe animals lack that, not thought. And then, of course, people point to evidence of sophisticated communication in some animals, trained parrots using words meaningfully, chimps using sign language, the complex bee dance.
Right, the bee dance is amazing.
Or even behaviors like insight learning, that sudden aha moment in problem solving, which seems to imply some kind of internal processing.
Okay, so lots of challenges to the language test. What about Descartes' second argument, the action test?
Here, Descartes focused on reason as a universal instrument. He meant the ability to apply general principles flexibly across all sorts of different situations. He argued that while animals might sometimes act as if following general rules, they don't show the ability to flexibly transfer knowledge learned in one context to completely novel situations. They act, he thought, more from instinct tailored to specific circumstances, not from understanding general principles.
So a dog might learn to fetch a specific ball in the yard, but couldn't apply a general fetch principle to a totally new object in a new place. Is that the idea?
Sort of, yeah. It's about transferring general rules, not just specific associations. But this has also been challenged. Some researchers argue that certain animal behaviors do show this kind of transfer.
Like the bees again?
Exactly. Those experiments where bees learned a rule like choose the same color and then applied the same rule, choose the same smell, to a different sense, olfaction. That suggests some abstraction and transfer.
Interesting.
Another major counter-argument questions Descartes' whole premise that reason is a single universal instrument.
Right, the alternative being.
The idea of modularity, that intelligence isn't one general ability, but more like a mental Swiss Army knife, a collection of specialized tools for different problems.
Like navigation, social interaction, tool use.
Precisely. So an animal can be brilliant in one domain without needing to be flexible across all domains to count as having reason. Its intelligence might be domain-specific.
That Swiss Army knife analogy really changes the picture. Okay, so let's fast forward a bit. In the 20th century, Donald Davidson made some influential arguments against animal thought and reason too, right?
Yes, Davidson was a major critic. He offered three interconnected arguments: the test of intentionality, the argument from holism, and his main argument linking belief and language. While maybe not as central today, they were hugely influential.
Let's take them one by one. The test of intentionality, what's that about?
Okay, this gets a bit technical. Davidson started from the idea that the content of our beliefs is very specific. Believing Benjamin Franklin invented bifocals isn't quite the same as believing the first U.S. Postmaster General invented bifocals, even though they refer to the same person.
Right, because the description you're using matters to the belief.
Exactly. That's intentionality, where substituting co-referring terms can change the truth of the statement about the belief. Davidson argued we can't justify attributing these fine-grained intentional beliefs to animals.
Why not?
Because for any behavior, say Fido chasing a cat up a tree, we could describe his belief in countless ways. Fido believes the cat is in the tree, Fido believes the small furry object is up the tall woody thing, and so on. Without language from Fido to specify how he conceives of the cat in the tree, Davidson argued there's no principled way to know which description captures his actual thought. The behavioral evidence is too ambiguous.
So the lack of language makes it impossible to pin down the precise content of an animal's thought.
That was the thrust of it. Some took this to mean if we can't verify the content, they don't have thoughts. But Davidson denied that interpretation. He mainly used it to undermine our confidence in intuitively attributing specific beliefs.
Did that argument face pushback too?
Yes. Critics argued we could potentially distinguish between attributions by careful study of discriminatory behavior in different contexts. Or we could just stipulate the meaning of terms in our attributions carefully.
Okay.
Also, a key distinction was made between didicto beliefs, about how the subject conceives things, and de re beliefs, simply about what the belief is about. Maybe when we say Fido believes the cat is in the tree, we're We're making a de claim identifying the cat and tree without claiming to know exactly how Fido thinks of them. Intentionality might only be a problem for de dicto attributions.
Right, that distinction seems important. What about Davidson's second point, the argument from holism?
Holism tackles whether we can even identify what an animal's belief is about in the first place. Davidson held a strong view. To have a belief about something, say, a cat, you need a vast, potentially infinite network of other true beliefs about cats and related concepts.
Infinite, that sounds like a lot.
It is. The idea is, to believe something about a cat, Fido would need beliefs like cats are physical objects, cats are animals, cats move, and so on. Without this rich background network, how do we know his thought is truly about the cat itself, and not just, say, a patch of cat-shaped color or a part of the cat?
And without language.
Davidson argued we couldn't justify attributing this necessary web of general beliefs.
That seems like an impossibly high bar even for humans.
Exactly. That's a major criticism. Such radical holism seems to imply that maybe no two humans ever have beliefs about the exact same thing, given our belief networks are never perfectly identical. That struck many as counterintuitive.
Okay, and Davidson's third main argument.
This one had two key steps. First, to have any belief, you must possess the concept of belief.
You need to understand what a belief is to have one.
That's the claim. Second, to possess the concept of belief, you must have language.
And the conclusion follows.
Animals lack language, therefore they lack the concept of belief, and therefore they lack beliefs altogether. And since belief was foundational for thought and reason, in his view, they lack those too.
How did he justify those two steps? They seem like big claims.
For the first step, belief requires the concept of belief. He linked belief to the capacity for surprise. If you believe P, you should be surprised if you find out not P.
Makes sense.
But being surprised by the falsity of your belief, he argued, means recognizing your belief was false. And that recognition requires having the concept of belief and falsity.
Okay, I can see the logic there, though maybe debatable. And the second step, linking the concept of belief to language.
This was more complex. He argued that having the concept of belief involves understanding objective truth, the idea that beliefs can be true or false independent of you.
Yeah.
And the only way to grasp this objectivity, Davidson thought, was through triangulation. Comparing your own responses to the world with the responses of others. This requires attributing beliefs to others to see where you agree or disagree, which, going back to his earlier arguments, he thought required language.
Wow, okay, a complex chain of reasoning. Were there counter-arguments to this main argument, too?
Oh yes, plenty. Many philosophers reject the first step, that having beliefs requires having the concept of belief. You can update your beliefs based on new evidence without necessarily thinking about the fact that you previously held a false belief.
Like my internal system just adjusts without me needing a concept of belief.
Exactly. Peter Carruthers, for instance, offered an account of surprise that doesn't involve higher-order thoughts about beliefs, but rather detecting conflict between the contents of beliefs. The feeling of surprise could be the bodily reaction to that conflict.
Okay. And the link between the concept of belief and language.
Robert Lurs argued that Davidson's earlier arguments, intentionality, holism, at best show that attributions to non-linguistic creatures aren't justified, not that they're impossible. The fact that we do attribute beliefs suggests it's possible.
Right.
And if we can attribute beliefs based on behavior, maybe animals could too, enabling triangulation without language. Furthermore, if some animals can attribute mental states, which is debated, but some studies suggest it, that would break the necessary link Davidson proposed between the concept of belief and language.
It really shows how tangled these issues are. Okay, so moving beyond these more general arguments, what about contemporary philosophers who accept animals might reason, but argue there are still significant limits?
Right, several philosophers have explored these potential limits. Jonathan Bennett, for example, argued that animals without language can't hold universal beliefs. All X's are Y, or beliefs about the past. X happened. Because, he argued, these types of beliefs can't be unambiguously expressed or demonstrated separately through non-linguistic behavior. What can't be shown separately in behavior can't exist as distinct mental states. So, animal thought might be confined to the here and now. He also doubted they could draw logical inferences from their beliefs. A dog might believe the cat is in the tree and there's an animal in the tree, but not conclude the second because of the first.
That idea of language being needed to separate out types of thoughts keeps coming back.
It does. Jose Bermudez argues something similar. that thinking about socks, what he called intentional assent, requires thinking about words, semantic assent. Since animals lack the latter, their thought is limited to observable states of affairs.
Thinking about thoughts needs language.
His argument was that holding a thought before the mind, the way needed for reasoning about it, requires formulating linguistically in a sentence you understand.
Okay. And John Searle. He also proposed limitations.
Yes. Searle focused on how specific linguistic abilities seem necessary for certain kinds of thought. He argued animals can't think about institutional facts, things like money or property, that exist only by human agreement.
Because those concepts are language dependent.
Exactly. Or the distant past, or logically complex facts, or anything requiring symbolic systems like math. He also made an interesting point about reasons for action.
Which was?
Since animals can't perform speech acts like asserting or promising, he argued they can't have desire-independent reasons for acting. They act only to satisfy immediate needs or desires, not out of a sense of duty, obligation, or commitment.
That would have implications for things like loyalty or courage in animals, wouldn't it?
It certainly raises questions about whether those qualities, as we understand them, require reasons beyond mere desire.
So these contemporary views highlight potential boundaries. But, as we said, there are also strong contemporary arguments for animal thought and reason. What are the main lines there?
We can group them into roughly four main types. First, there's the argument from intentional systems theory, most famously associated with Daniel Dennett.
Dennett again. What's this theory?
The idea is that our everyday concepts of mental states, belief, desire, perception, etc., are theoretical tools derived from folk psychology. That's our common sense way of explaining and predicting behavior by assuming rationality.
Okay.
Dennett argues that if treating an animal as if it has beliefs and desires, adopting the intentional stance, allows us to successfully predict and explain its behavior, then the animal genuinely has those intentional states.
So if assuming my dog wants a treat and believes I have one explains why it's sitting and staring at me, then it does want the treat and believe I have it.
In Dennett's instrumentalist view, yes. What matters is the predictive and explanatory success of the stance, not necessarily finding a specific belief module in the brain.
What are the criticisms of that?
The main ones are that intentional states feel like subjective experiences, not just predictive tools. And also that this approach might end up attributing beliefs and desires to things like thermostats, if their behavior can be predicted that way.
Right, the thermostat wants to reach the target temperature. Okay, what's the second type of argument?
That's common sense functionalism, associated with philosophers like Jerry Fodor and Peter Carruthers. Like Dennett, it views folk psychology concepts as theoretical. But unlike Dennett, it takes a realist stance.
Realist meaning?
Meaning that having an intentional state like a belief requires having a specific internal state in the brain, a physical state that plays the causal role and has the structure described by folk psychology, often linked to the idea of a language of thought.
So Fido believing the cat is in the tree means there's some brain state structured like that sentence causing his behavior.
Roughly, yes. The argument is, since folk psychology works well in explaining animal behavior, we have reason to believe animals possess these structured internal states.
And the objections here?
Critics argue it makes belief attribution too speculative. Are we really saying animal brains have sentence-like structures? Others raise challenges based on the generality constraint. If an animal can think A relates to B, can it also think B relates to A? Does animal thought really have that kind of systematic structure?
Okay. Third argument.
The argument from biological naturalism, which comes from John Searle. Yes, same Searle who argued for limitations.
Okay. How does he argue for animal thought here?
Searle's view is that intentional states are fundamentally subjective. Conscious experiences caused by brain biochemistry. Beliefs are experiences with conditions of satisfaction, mind to world fit. Desires have conditions of satisfaction, world to mind fit.
And why attribute these to animals?
Searle gives two main reasons. First, perceived similarity. Their perceptual organs look similar to ours, suggesting similar sensory experiences. Second, explanatory necessity. We often have to assume intentional states to make sense of their behavior. Why does the dog keep barking at the empty tree? Because it still believes the squirrel is there and wants to get it.
But what are the problems with this view?
A key one is, how similar do animal brain states need to be to ours to cause relevant subjective experiences? Brains aren't identical. If we found the belief chemical in humans, how similar would an animal's version need to be? Searle admits behavior alone isn't the answer unless it's caused by sufficiently similar physiology.
Which seems hard, maybe impossible to know for sure.
Right. It potentially makes animal intentionality unknowable. Also, relying on perceived organ similarity seems shaky. We assume birds hear even if we don't see obvious external ears.
Makes sense. And the fourth argument.
This is the argument from science. It's more straightforward. The basic idea is we trust science on other matters, like the causes of disease. We should also trust the developing science of animal cognition.
And that science uses mental state terms.
Increasingly, yes. Especially since the decline of strict behaviorism and the rise of cognitive science, researchers studying animal behavior find it useful, even necessary, to talk about animal beliefs, desires, memory, planning, even consciousness, to explain their findings.
So if it's useful for scientific explanation,
Then we have good grounds to believe animals actually have these states.
but is using folk psychology terms in science universally accepted?
Not entirely. There are concerns about scientific respectability. Are these explanations truly causal in the way science usually demands? Are they objective, especially when dealing with subjective states like consciousness, where the gold standard in humans is often verbal report?
Which animals can't provide.
Exactly. Responses include adopting functionalist interpretations, where states are defined by causal roles, not necessarily subjective feel, or developing new, nonverbal, objective measures for things like consciousness.
Okay, wow. That's a lot on thought and reason. But we still have the whole other dimension, animal consciousness. That feels like an even deeper puzzle.
It really is. The distinction between conscious and unconscious mental states is crucial. And figuring out if animals have conscious states has huge theoretical, moral, and practical significance.
Morally, because consciousness seems linked to suffering and well-being.
Precisely. If an experience is felt, it seems to matter morally in a way an unconscious process doesn't. The two main philosophical approaches here are higher-order theories and first-order theories of consciousness.
Let's start with higher-order theories. What's the core idea?
The basic principle is that a mental state is conscious only if the creature has some kind of higher-order awareness of that mental state. The different theories debate what that higher-order awareness consists of.
Okay, so what are the main types of higher-order theories?
One type is inner sense theories. These theories liken this higher-order awareness to a kind of internal perception scanning your own mind, basically.
Like having an inner eye looking at your thoughts or feelings.
Sort of, yeah. An important feature is that this inner sense doesn't necessarily require having higher-order thoughts or concepts about mental states. An animal wouldn't need to think, I am in pain, to be consciously aware of the pain via this inner sense.
Which might make it more plausible for animals.
Some proponents argue exactly that. And there are some contestant studies suggesting animals show metacognition awareness of their own uncertainty, memory strength, or knowledge, which could be interpreted as evidence for this kind of higher-order awareness.
But what are the problems with this inner sense idea?
Critics point out there's no obvious sensory organ in the brain for this inner perception, unlike vision or hearing. There's no distinct phenomenology, no unique feeling associated with being aware of a state via inner sense. And you can't, mentally squint to get a better inner look at your thoughts. It also struggles to explain how concept-laden states like beliefs could become conscious via a non-conceptual inner sense.
Okay. What's the other main type of higher-order theory?
Those are higher-order thought HOT theories. They propose that a mental state is conscious if and only if you have, or are disposed to have, a higher-order thought about being in that state.
So consciousness requires thinking about your mental state.
Yes. And this immediately raises questions about animals, because many philosophers argue animals lack the capacity for these kinds of higher-order thoughts.
Why? What's needed for these thoughts that animals might lack?
One major argument is that HOTs typically involve the concept of I, the self that is having the thought or feeling. To have this concept, some argue, requires understanding oneself as a subject of experiences persisting through time, which seems to rely heavily on language, indexicals like I, and thinking about past and future selves.
But are there counters to that? Could animals have HOTs without a full-blown I concept or language?
Yes, some argue the required self-concept might be much more minimal, perhaps just this body or the subject of these experiences. Maybe results from mere self-recognition tests in some animals hint at this minimal self-concept.
Right.
Others argue HOTs that confer consciousness don't even need an I concept. You could be aware that pain is occurring in the same way you're aware that it is raining, without attributing the state to a specific subject.
Okay, so maybe the I isn't the biggest hurdle. What else?
The more common objection is that HOTs require sophisticated cognitive capacities. namely linguistic ability and concepts of mental states, like belief, pain, which, as we discussed with Davidson and others, many argue animals lack. If you can't form the thought that you are in pain, then according to H.I.'s theory, your pain isn't conscious.
But again, are there arguments for animals having these capacities?
Some philosophers, like Carruthers, argue it's conceivable to have non-linguistic HITs. And there's the ongoing debate, based on experimental evidence, about whether some animals can attribute mental states to others, theory of mind, which might imply they possess the necessary concepts for HITs about themselves. Though that evidence is highly contested and often has alternative, simpler explanations.
So, higher-order theories present significant hurdles for widespread animal consciousness. What about the alternative first-order theories?
First-order theories take a different approach. They propose that what makes a mental state conscious isn't a higher-order state about it, but rather something about the state itself specifically, its role in making the organism aware of the external environment.
How does that work?
The idea is that a mental state, like a perception, is conscious if it makes information available to the systems responsible for belief formation and guiding action. If seeing the red apple leads you to believe there's a red apple and maybe you reach for it, that perception is conscious. A perception that registers but doesn't get through to influence belief or behavior wouldn't be conscious.
So, if an animal forms beliefs about the world based on its senses,
Then, according to first-order theories, those sensory states are conscious. Proponents argue this aligns well with our intuitions. Many animals, from fish to chimps, clearly form beliefs based on perception and bodily sensations. So they'd have conscious perceptions and sensations.
and this seems simpler, more parsimonious.
Yes, that's often claimed. It attributes consciousness more widely to animals like bats or mice that we intuitively feel have conscious experiences but might doubt possess complex higher-order thoughts.
But do first-order theories handle all conscious states well? What about conscious beliefs or desires themselves?
That's considered a major challenge. How does a belief become conscious on this view? It doesn't directly represent the external environment in the same way perception does.
So how do they address that?
Often by adopting a hybrid view. They might say perceptual states and sensations are conscious via this first-order mechanism, making info available. But beliefs and desires require a higher-order thought to become conscious.
Ah, a mix-and-match approach. Does that solve the problem?
It faces its own issues. First, it again seems to limit conscious belief and desire to animals capable of higher-order thought, which might be too restrictive given how we explain animal behavior using folk psychology, assuming conscious beliefs desires.
Right.
Second, if conscious perception requires making information available to the conscious belief-forming system, and conscious beliefs require ACTs, then maybe first-order theories don't actually broaden the scope of animal consciousness much beyond high-G theories after all. It seems a purely first-order account of conscious belief and desire is still needed.
Wow. Okay, so the debate between first-order and higher-order theories and the hybrid options shows just how tricky defining and identifying consciousness is, especially beyond humans.
Absolutely. And we've really only scratched the surface. Beyond thought, reason, and consciousness, the philosophy of animal minds delves into so many other fascinating areas.
Like what else?
Well, the nature of animal emotions, are they just physiological reactions or do they have subjective feelings and cognitive content like ours? The possibility of propositional knowledge in animals. Foundational questions about the methods we use to study animal minds like Lloyd Morgan's canon about not attributing higher faculties if lower ones suffice.
And things like anthropomorphism. When is it justified? When is it misleading?
Exactly. Plus the whole history of how these ideas have evolved over centuries. It's a really rich and constantly developing field.
It truly is. Well, that brings us towards the end of this particular deep dive. Just to recap, we've explored the incredible complexity surrounding animal minds, looking at diverse philosophical views on thought, reason, and consciousness, from Hume and Descartes, right up to contemporary debates involving Dennett, Searle, functionalism, and theories of consciousness.
And it's clear that our understanding is constantly being shaped by both ongoing philosophical argument and new scientific discoveries. It's a very dynamic interplay.
And hopefully this discussion connects with everyone listening, whether it helps you think differently about your own animal companions, appreciate the sheer diversity of intelligence in nature, or just grapple with some fundamental questions about what minds are.
Definitely. Thinking about animal minds really encourages us to reflect on our own place in the natural world and consider the inner lives of other creatures.
So, for a final thought to leave everyone with, considering the different ways we've talked about defining consciousness today, higher order, first order, maybe something else, how might adopting one view over another change how we interact with the animal world? Is the key to understanding animal minds ultimately found in their behavior, their brain structure, or perhaps something else entirely?
A great question to ponder.
We'll leave that with you. Thanks so much for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.